Most academy corridors were designed with military precision, clean lines, sterile lighting, and absolutely zero tolerance for anything that might be considered irregular. Before we begin, YouTube shows me that 93% of you haven't subscribed yet. Subscribing is free, it really supports our community, and I'd love for you to be part of it. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. So naturally, when 3 juvenile Kethmori war beasts decided to parade down Corridor 9 like they owned the place, it caused something of a stir. Zala walked between them, her standard-issue boots clicking against the polished floor in a rhythm that somehow matched the soft padding of 6 massive paws. She wasn't leading them exactly. More like they'd all agreed on the same destination and happened to be traveling together. The difference was subtle, but important, though she doubted Security Chief Beckmore would appreciate the distinction. "Cadet!" The voice boomed across the corridor with the authority of someone who'd spent decades perfecting his intimidation technique. "Stop right there!" Zala paused, glancing down at Forge, who'd positioned himself at her left side. The cub, if you could call something the size of a small hovercar a cub, looked up at her with eyes that glowed like amber circuits. His crystalline mane caught the overhead lights and scattered them into tiny rainbows across the wall. "Well," she murmured to him, "here we go." Beckmore approached with the kind of measured stride that suggested he was either very important or very constipated. Possibly both. His species, the Veltari, were known for their multiple eyes. In his case, 6 of them arranged in 2 neat rows across his elongated skull. Right now, all 6 were fixed on Zala, with the kind of attention usually reserved for incoming missiles. "Cadet Zala," he said, his translator struggling with the clicking undertones of his native language. "Would you care to explain why there are 3 unauthorized biological entities following you through my corridors?" Zala considered this question with the gravity it deserved, which was approximately none at all. "They're not following me, sir. They're choosing to walk in the same direction I happen to be walking." 2 of Beckmore's eyes twitched. "Semantics will not—" "Also," Zala continued, because apparently she had a death wish, "I'm not sure following is the right word. Forge here is actually leading. I'm just keeping up." As if to prove her point, Forge took a step forward and sat down, his massive haunches settling onto the floor with a soft thud. Whisper, the smallest of the 3, mimicked his position on Zala's right. Ghost remained standing, but his attention had shifted to something down the corridor that only he could see. "They are not registered Academy wildlife," Beckmore stated, consulting the datapad that seemed permanently attached to his left arm. "They are not service animals. They are not cleared for student interaction. They are, in fact, classified as Class 9 combat entities, which makes their presence here not just unauthorized, but actively dangerous." "Funny thing about that classification," Zala said, crossing her arms. "Who exactly classified them?" "The Galactic Wildlife Management Bureau, in conjunction with—" "Right. Bunch of bureaucrats who've never actually met a Kethmori war beast." She gestured to Whisper, who had begun grooming one of her massive paws with the dedication of someone who took personal hygiene very seriously. "Does she look like she's about to go on a combat rampage?" "Appearances can be deceiving, Cadet. These creatures are telepathic predators with documented aggressive tendencies toward threats," Zala interrupted. Key word being threats. "When's the last time you felt threatened by a grooming routine?" Beckmore's mandibles clicked in what his species considered a sign of extreme irritation. The regulations are clear. All non-registered biological entities must be removed from Academy premises immediately. And how exactly do you propose to remove them? Security teams are already en route with appropriate containment equipment. Zala glanced down at Ghost, who had turned his attention back to the conversation. His ears, if you could call the crystalline formations jutting from his skull ears, were pricked forward in what she'd learned to recognize as his listening pose. Not the casual listening he did during normal conversation, but the focused attention he gave to potential problems. "Sir," she said, and something in her tone made Beckmore's eyes narrow. "With respect, that might not be the best approach. Are you threatening me, Cadet? I'm not threatening anyone. But these three? They don't take kindly to being caged. And before you ask how I know that." She paused, running her hand along Forge's crystalline mane. The gesture was automatic now. Muscle memory developed over months of similar conversations. "It's a long story." "Then perhaps you should start from the beginning." Zala checked her chronometer. She was supposed to be in advanced tactical theory in 20 minutes, but Professor Kelthon would understand. He always understood when it came to Zala's complications. "6 months ago," she began, settling into the story like slipping on a comfortable jacket. "I was the newest problem cadet in Block C. You know Block C, right? Where they put all the students who don't quite fit the standard mold?" Beckmore's expression suggested he was intimately familiar with Block C and its residents. "My roommate was Jinx. Lovely individual, really. Jinx's species, the Moradani, they're known for being cautious. And by cautious, I mean they consider breathing too quickly a potentially life-threatening activity." She scratched behind Whisper's ear, earning a contented rumble that sounded like a purring engine. "So there I was, trying to adapt to Academy life, when I wake up one morning to find Jinx practically vibrating with terror in the corner of our quarters. And there, sitting on my bed like he'd always belonged there, was this guy." Forge turned his massive head to look at her, and she could have sworn she saw amusement in those glowing eyes. No alarms had gone off, no security breaches, no broken windows or forced locks. He was just there. About half his current size, but still impressive enough to make Jinx question every life choice that had led to sharing a room with a human. "How did it get inside?" Beckmore demanded. "That," Zala said with a grin, "was exactly what I asked him." She remembered that morning with perfect clarity. Forge, smaller then but no less magnificent, had tilted his head at her question and made a sound that was part chirp, part growl, and entirely confident. Then he'd walked over to the door, pressed one massive paw against the access panel, and somehow, impossibly, the door had opened. "Turns out," she continued, "Kethmori war beasts are a lot smarter than anyone gives them credit for. They're not just telepathic, they're natural hackers. Something about their neural structure lets them interface with electronic systems in ways that make our best technicians weep with envy." "That's impossible," Beckmore stated flatly. "Is it? Then, how do you explain 3 cubs wandering freely through your corridors without triggering a single security alert?" The security chief's mandibles clicked again, but this time it sounded more thoughtful than irritated. His multiple eyes began scanning the datapad with increased intensity. "The first few days were interesting," Zala continued. "Jinx refused to sleep in the same room as what they called a miniature death machine. I tried explaining that Forge seemed perfectly harmless, but you know how it is with interspecies prejudice. Hard to overcome a few million years of evolutionary caution." She paused, remembering those early mornings when she'd wake to find Forge curled up at the foot of her bed, his crystalline mane dim in sleep mode. Jinx would be pressed against the far wall, wide-eyed and twitchy, having spent the night convinced that they were all going to be devoured in their sleep. But then something happened during our first major combat simulation. You remember that one? The asteroid field scenario, where half the first-year cadets washed out? Beckmore nodded slowly. He would remember. It had been a disaster of epic proportions. I was partnered with Jinx, which should have been a complete failure. Their natural caution combined with let's call it my creative interpretation of standard procedures. We should have been space debris within the first 10 minutes. Instead, they'd somehow managed to not only survive the simulation, but excel at it. Their unlikely partnership had become the talk of the Academy for weeks. Except we had an advantage nobody else knew about. Forge had somehow gotten into the simulation chamber. Don't ask me how, because security footage shows him walking through 3 sealed doors like they weren't even there. And once the simulation started, he began doing something I'd never seen before. Zala looked down at the 3 cubs, all of whom were now giving her their full attention. It still amazed her how they could make her feel like the most important person in the galaxy, with nothing more than focused interest. He started guiding us, not controlling. Kathmori don't work that way. But he'd move in a certain direction, and somehow Jinx and I would find ourselves following. He'd pause at what seemed like random moments, and we'd pause too. He'd look toward empty space, and we'd discover incoming asteroids that our sensors hadn't detected yet. Telepathic prediction, Beckmore murmured, his scientific curiosity apparently overriding his administrative frustration. More than that, he was thinking 3 moves ahead, like the galaxy's most dangerous chess master. And he was sharing that tactical awareness with us, not through words or images, but through intuition, I guess. Suddenly, Jinx's caution wasn't paranoia. It was strategic patience. And my improvisation wasn't recklessness. It was adaptive flexibility. The memory still gave her chills. That moment when she'd realized they weren't just 3 separate beings stumbling through a simulation. They were a team, connected by something deeper than communication. We didn't just pass that simulation. We set a new Academy record that still hasn't been broken. Beckmore's datapad chimed, and he glanced down at it with growing concern. Security teams report they cannot locate the cubs. Sensors show them in this corridor, but visual confirmation is inconsistent. Zala didn't need to look down to know that Ghost had activated what she privately called his suggestion field, a low-level telepathic influence that made observers look past him unless they were specifically focused on his location. It was a defensive mechanism, not an aggressive one, but it played merry hell with security systems designed by species that didn't understand telepathic camouflage. That would be Ghost. He showed up during my 3rd week, right in the middle of advanced reactor theory. Professor Dulmax was explaining the safety protocols for handling antimatter containment when all the lights went out. She remembered the moment perfectly. The sudden darkness, the rising panic of 60 cadets trapped in a classroom with an active antimatter demonstration, and then the soft glow of crystalline formations appearing near the emergency exit. Emergency lighting failed. Backup systems failed. Even the manual releases on the doors had somehow malfunctioned. We were trapped in a room with enough antimatter to turn the entire Academy into a very large crater. Beckmore's eyes widened. That particular incident had been classified, but rumors had spread throughout the Academy for weeks. 60 panicked cadets, one increasingly frantic professor, and a containment field that was showing signs of instability. And then Ghost just walked through the wall. Through it? Phase shifting. Another fun Kethmori ability that doesn't make it into the official databases. He looked around the room, assessed the situation, and then did something that still makes the engineering department break out in nervous sweats. Zala reached down to scratch Ghost behind what passed for his ears, earning a pleased rumble. He interfaced directly with the containment field. Not the control systems, the actual antimatter containment itself, stabilized it, rerouted power from non-essential systems, and somehow managed to get the emergency exits working again. A juvenile Kethmori successfully managed an antimatter containment field. A juvenile Kethmori saved 63 lives and prevented a catastrophic explosion that would have taken out half the academy. But officially, it was credited to exceptional quick thinking by academy maintenance personnel. The irony wasn't lost on her. Ghost had performed what amounted to a miracle of emergency engineering, and the official report had attributed his actions to unnamed janitors. The third one, Whisper, she showed up during my 6th week, right in the middle of my disciplinary hearing. Beckmore's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. I remember that hearing. Right, you were there. Remember how Commander Kulnax was explaining why my unconventional approach to the stealth infiltration exercise had resulted in 3 broken training drones and a minor diplomatic incident with the Zenthari ambassador? That had been one of her more spectacular failures. The exercise was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance mission, but somehow she'd ended up accidentally infiltrating an actual diplomatic reception instead of the simulated one. The confusion had resulted in several very confused ambassadors, and a stern lecture about the importance of double-checking mission parameters. And then, right in the middle of his speech about responsibility and proper protocol, this little ball of fur and crystals comes strolling through the conference room like she owns the place. Whisper, as if responding to the memory, stood up and stretched, displaying the graceful flexibility that had made her Zayla's favorite sparring partner. She walked straight up to Commander Kulnax, sat down in front of his desk, and just looked at him. Not aggressive, not threatening, just present. Zala smiled, remembering the moment when the room's entire dynamic had shifted. And suddenly, instead of a disciplinary hearing about a problem cadet, we were having a discussion about adaptive thinking and the value of unconventional solutions. The commander is known for his flexibility in interpreting regulations, Beckmore admitted. Whisper has this effect on people. She makes them see situations differently. Not through mental manipulation, Kethmori don't work that way. But she has this ability to project calm, I guess, perspective. She helps people step back from their immediate reactions and consider the bigger picture. As if to demonstrate, Whisper moved closer to Beckmore, careful not to make any sudden movements. The security chief tensed initially, but as she settled down a few feet away and simply existed peacefully, his posture gradually relaxed. Which brings us to today, Zala continued, noting the subtle change in Beckmore's demeanor. And your question about why they follow me. She looked down at the 3 cubs, each of whom had positioned themselves in a loose triangle around her. Not protective positioning. She'd learned to recognize that. This was something else. Something that had taken her months to understand. They don't follow me because I'm their leader. They don't follow me because I feed them or shelter them or protect them. They follow me because. She paused, searching for the right words to explain something that had never needed explanation before. Because they chose me, and I chose them, not as pets, not as guards, not as tools or weapons or status symbols, as partners. Beckmore's 6 eyes blinked in sequence, a sure sign that his mental processes were working overtime. Partnership implies equality, Cadet. These are animals. Are they? Zala asked, and something in her tone made all 3 cubs lift their heads simultaneously. Because last week, when Lieutenant Vexitar's navigation computer crashed during the deep space survival exercise, it was Forge who figured out how to jury-rig a quantum compass using spare parts from a broken food replicator. She remembered the look of stunned disbelief on Vexitar's face when a dumb animal had solved an engineering problem that had stumped 2 Academy instructors and a visiting expert from the Galactic Navigation Guild. And 2 weeks ago, when that first-year cadet, what was his name, Nixol, had that breakdown during psychological evaluation, it was Whisper who sat with him for 6 hours straight until he could function again. The incident had become something of a legend among the student body. Nixol, a promising cadet from a high-pressure family background, had completely shut down during a routine stress assessment. The counseling staff had tried everything: medication, therapy, even bringing in a specialist in his species' psychology. Nothing had worked until Whisper had simply walked into the room and settled down beside his chair. She didn't do anything dramatic, Zala continued. Didn't try to fix him or force him to talk. She just stayed. And somehow, her presence gave him the space he needed to work through whatever was eating him alive. Beckmore consulted his data pad again, his mandibles clicking in what Zala had learned to interpret as deep thought. There have been unusual patterns in Academy performance metrics since your arrival, such as disciplinary incidents down 30%, academic performance up across all year levels, psychological stress indicators at historic lows. He paused, studying her with all 6 eyes, and a significant increase in what the reports term innovative, problem-solving approaches. Zala grinned. Funny how that works. The truth was, she'd noticed the changes, too. The Academy had always been a pressure cooker. Brilliant young beings from across the galaxy, all competing for limited positions in the most prestigious military organization in known space. The stress levels were traditionally brutal, the washout rate astronomical, and the social dynamics poisonous. But somehow, over the past few months, things had softened. Not the standards. Those remained as demanding as ever. But the atmosphere had shifted from cutthroat competition to something more collaborative. Students helped each other instead of sabotaging. Instructors found themselves dealing with creative solutions instead of rigid adherence to textbook procedures. The whole place felt more alive, more dynamic. Commander Kulnax seems to believe you're responsible for these improvements, Beckmore noted. Commander Kulnax gives me too much credit. That was both true and not true. Kulnax, the battle-scarred veteran who'd somehow become her unofficial mentor, had indeed taken credit for what he called her beneficial influence on Academy culture. But Zala knew better. The real credit belonged to 3 crystalline-maned cubs who'd somehow managed to make everyone around them think more clearly, act more calmly, and solve problems more creatively. He also seems to believe that your companions represent an evolutionary leap in human-alien cooperation. Commander Kulnax has been known to get philosophical after his evening meal. Beckmore's translator made a sound that might have been a chuckle. Indeed. However, his combat record suggests his opinions carry significant weight, with Academy administration, which was the only reason Zala wasn't currently in a detention cell awaiting transport back to Earth, she suspected. Kulnax had fought in more battles than most species had names for, and his endorsement carried more weight than a dozen regulation manuals. The point is, she continued, getting back to the heart of the matter, they're not here because I summoned them, or captured them, or trained them. They're here because they want to be here, and trying to remove them against their will. She gestured to Ghost, who had begun that subtle shimmer that meant he was preparing to phase shift. Well, that's going to be more complicated than your security teams are prepared for. You're saying they won't allow themselves to be contained. I'm saying they're not property to be contained. They're individuals with their own agency, their own decision-making capabilities, and their own very strong opinions about how they want to spend their time. As if to emphasize the point, Forge stood up and walked over to Beckmore's dropped data pad. The security chief had been so focused on the conversation that he hadn't noticed when it slipped from his grasp. Forge picked it up delicately in his massive jaws and returned it with the kind of courtesy that would have made a diplomat proud. "Thank you," Beckmore said automatically, then stopped as he realized what he'd just done. "See?" Zala said. "When's the last time you thanked a piece of equipment for cooperating?" Beckmore stared down at his data pad, then at Forge, then back at the pad. "This is unprecedented." Most worthwhile things are. The corridor had begun to fill with other cadets making their way to afternoon classes. Zala watched as they navigated around her little group with practiced ease. No fear, no excessive curiosity, just the casual acceptance that came from months of shared space. A few even nodded greeting to the cubs, who responded with the kind of dignified acknowledgement that suggested they understood social protocols perfectly. "They've integrated," Beckmore observed, following her gaze. "They've been accepted," Zala corrected. "There's a difference. Integration implies adaptation to existing systems. Acceptance implies the systems adapting to accommodate them." A group of third-year cadets approached, deep in discussion about some theoretical problem from advanced quantum mechanics. As they passed, one of them, a tall, green-scaled Luxani named Muldar, paused and looked down at Whisper. "Hey, Whisper," he said casually, "you wouldn't happen to have any insights on wave-particle duality in non-Euclidean space, would you?" Whisper tilted her head, considering the question with the kind of serious attention she brought to all intellectual challenges. Then she stood up, walked over to a section of the corridor wall where the lighting created interesting shadow patterns, and began moving in what looked like a complex dance. "She's demonstrating the mathematical relationship," Muldar breathed, watching her movements with growing excitement. "Look, the way she's positioning herself relative to the light sources. She's showing how particles behave differently, depending on observational framework." His study group gathered around, watching as Whisper continued her demonstration. Her movements were graceful, precise, and utterly convincing as a visual representation of quantum mechanical principles. "Brilliant," one of them whispered. "Why didn't our professors think of kinesthetic learning approaches?" "Because," Zala said quietly, "your professors think in terms of textbooks and data streams. Whisper thinks in terms of movement and relationship and the poetry of physics." The study group spent another few minutes watching Whisper's demonstration, taking notes and asking follow-up questions that she answered through subtle shifts in positioning and movement. Finally, they thanked her, genuinely thanked her, and continued on their way, chattering excitedly about new approaches to their coursework. "That happens at least 3 times a day," Zala told Beckmore, who had watched the entire exchange with the fascination of someone witnessing something completely outside his experience. Each of them has become an unofficial teaching assistant for different subjects. Forge helps with tactical analysis, Ghost with engineering problems, and Whisper with anything that requires thinking about systems in non-traditional ways. They're tutoring other students? They're sharing their perspectives, which, it turns out, are often exactly what stuck students need to break through their conceptual barriers. Beckmore made notes on his data pad with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was completely rewriting his understanding of the situation. The academic performance improvements you mentioned, partly because students are less stressed, partly because they're thinking more creatively, and partly because they've got access to 3 different types of intelligence that complement traditional academic approaches. She watched as another group of cadets passed by, this time stopping to show Ghost some kind of technical schematic. The cub studied it for a moment, then gently tapped a specific section with one crystalline claw. The cadets examined the spot he'd indicated, and their faces lit up with understanding. What did he just do? Probably identified a design flaw that would have caused a cascade failure under stress conditions. Ghost has this ability to see weak points in systems, not just mechanical systems, but organizational ones, logical ones, even social ones. As if responding to his name, Ghost looked up from the schematic and fixed his glowing gaze on a point somewhere behind Beckmore. His ears pricked forward in that focused listening pose Zala had learned to pay attention to. "What's he hearing?" Beckmore asked, following her gaze. "I'm not sure. But when Ghost gets that look, it usually means—" The corridor's emergency lighting flickered once, twice, then stabilized. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but Zala had learned to pay attention to the small details that preceded larger problems. "How long until your security teams arrive?" she asked. Beckmore checked his chronometer. "They should already be here. The delay is unusual." Ghost stood up and walked to the nearest wall panel, pressing his paw against the surface. The panel lit up with diagnostic information that scrolled too quickly for human eyes to follow, but Zala could see enough to recognize what she was looking at. "System maintenance logs," she murmured. "Someone's been accessing restricted areas of the Academy's network." "That's impossible. All network access requires authorization codes and biometric confirmation and quantum encryption, and about 6 other layers of security that are supposed to make unauthorized access impossible," Zala finished. "But Ghost isn't accessing the network. He's reading it, like looking at footprints to see who's been walking where." The diagnostic information shifted, displaying what looked like a map of the Academy's internal systems. Red indicators showed areas of recent activity, most of which corresponded to normal operational patterns. But there were several clusters of activity in areas that should have been dormant. "Maintenance tunnels," Beckmore said, his voice tight with concern. "Storage areas. And the central communications hub?" Ghost stepped back from the panel and looked directly at Zala. In his eyes, she saw something she'd never seen before. Genuine concern. Not the casual alertness he brought to everyday problems, but the focused intensity he reserved for actual threats. "We need to find your security teams," she said, "because I don't think they're just running late." Beckmore was already activating his personal communicator. "Security Central, this is Chief Beckmore. Status report on containment teams." Static answered him. Then, after a long moment, a distorted voice. "Sir, we have a situation. Teams are currently investigating an anomaly in Sector 9. Please stand by for—" The transmission cut off abruptly. Forge, who had been calmly observing the conversation, suddenly moved to Zala's left side and pressed against her leg. not seeking comfort, offering support. Whisper mirrored the movement on her right, while Ghost positioned himself facing down the corridor in the direction of Sector 9. "Whatever's happening," Zayla said quietly. "They know about it before we do." Beckmore's mandibles were clicking rapidly now, a sure sign of extreme stress. This is not a coincidence. 3 unauthorized entities arrive at the Academy, and suddenly we have security failures and communication disruptions? "You're right," Zala said. "It's not a coincidence. But not in the way you're thinking." She looked down at the 3 cubs, each of whom was now alert and focused in ways that had nothing to do with casual curiosity. This was their combat stance, not aggressive, but ready, prepared for whatever was coming. "They didn't come here to cause problems," she continued. "They came here because they sensed problems were coming. The question is, what kind of problems require 3 Kethmori war beasts to handle?" The answer came in the form of klaxons, the deep, bone-rattling wail that meant someone was having a very bad day, and that day was about to become everyone else's problem. "All personnel to emergency stations," the Academy's AI announced with the kind of artificial calm that fooled absolutely no one. "This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." Beckmore's 6 eyes went wide. "Hostile contacts detected," he read from his datapad. "Multiple ships approaching from—" He paused, his mandibles clicking frantically. "That's impossible." "What's impossible?" Zala asked, though she suspected she already knew. "They're coming from inside the asteroid field." Nothing larger than a fighter should be able to navigate those passages, but sensors are showing capital ship signatures. Ghost had begun that low rumble that meant he was seriously displeased about something. Forge and Whisper flanked Zala more closely, their crystalline manes brightening as their internal systems shifted to combat readiness. "Defense grid status?" Zala asked. "Offline for scheduled maintenance," Beckmore replied, his voice hollow. "All primary weapon systems are down for the next 6 hours." "Scheduled by whom?" Before Beckmore could answer, the corridor lights flickered and died, replaced by emergency illumination that cast everything in hellish red. The change in lighting revealed something that had been invisible before. Ghost was glowing. Not his manes, but his entire body, with a soft bioluminescence that suggested his phase-shifting abilities were working overtime. "He's scanning," Zala murmured, "looking for something that shouldn't be here." "Scanning for what?" "For whoever scheduled that maintenance." She knelt down beside Ghost, placing her hand on his flank. The contact allowed her to sense, dimly, what his enhanced perceptions were telling him. There's someone in the Academy who doesn't belong. Someone who's been here long enough to access restricted systems, but who isn't. Right. Ghost's glow intensified, and suddenly he was moving. Not walking, but flowing through solid matter like it was made of mist. Forge and Whisper immediately followed, leaving Zala and Beckmore to chase after them through corridors that were rapidly filling with panicked cadets. "Where are they going?" Beckmore demanded, his dignity forgotten as he tried to keep up with Zala's longer strides. "Maintenance tunnels, if I had to guess. Ghost doesn't phase shift unless he needs to go somewhere the normal routes won't take him." They reached a maintenance access that should have been sealed, but the heavy door stood open. Beyond it lay a maze of service corridors that most cadets never saw, the hidden arteries that kept the Academy functioning. "Sir," Zala said, catching Beckmore's arm, "I need you to do something that's going to sound completely insane." At this point, Cadet, insane sounds refreshingly normal. "I need you to trust them. Whatever they do, whatever it looks like, trust that they know what they're doing." Beckmore's 6 eyes focused on her with laser intensity. "You're asking me to bet the Academy's safety on 3 animals. I'm asking you to bet it on 3 beings who've spent months learning every system, every person, every pattern in this place, who've been preparing for this moment since the day they arrived." A new sound echoed through the maintenance tunnels. Not the cubs, but footsteps. Human footsteps, moving with the kind of careful precision that suggested someone who knew exactly where they were going. "That's not a cadet," Zala whispered. "How can you tell?" "Wrong rhythm. Cadets move like they're trying to get somewhere. That person is moving like they're trying not to be noticed." They followed the sound deeper into the tunnels, guided by the occasional glimpse of crystalline light ahead. The Academy's emergency systems were failing in sequence. First communications, then internal. Sensors, now environmental controls. Someone was systematically shutting down everything that might interfere with an invasion. The defense grid wasn't down for maintenance, Zala realized. It was sabotaged. By whom? The answer came from around the next corner, in the form of a familiar voice speaking in urgent, clipped tones. "Phase 3 is complete. Primary systems are offline. You have a clear approach vector." Zala's blood turned to ice water. She knew that voice, had shared a room with it for months, had listened to it express worry about everything from food temperatures to atmospheric pressure variations. "Jinx," she whispered. Her roommate stood in a junction of maintenance tunnels, speaking into a communication device that definitely wasn't Academy-issued. Around them, the cubs had formed a loose circle, not threatening, but very clearly blocking any escape routes. "I told you they were dangerous," Jinx was saying, apparently oblivious to their audience. "The human and her pets. They're disrupting everything, making people think differently. The old ways are being forgotten, and if we don't act now—" They turned and saw Zala. For a moment, the 2 roommates stared at each other across a gulf that had opened between them without either realizing it. "Hello, Jinx," Zala said quietly. "Having a nice chat with whoever's about to turn our home into a smoking crater?" "You don't understand," Jinx replied, their voice carrying that familiar note of barely controlled panic. "They're coming to restore order, to remove the chaos you've brought. The chaos of people getting along better, of students helping each other instead of competing, of finding new ways to solve old problems. The chaos of change," Jinx snapped, "of abandoning proven methods for untested experiments, of trusting animals to make decisions that should be left to rational minds." Zala looked at the cubs, who were watching the exchange with the kind of patient attention they brought to all human drama, waiting to see how she would handle this. "They're not animals, Jinx. And they're not making our decisions for us. They're just helping us make better ones. By influencing our thoughts. By manipulating our emotions. By being themselves," Zala said simply. "And by showing us that there are more ways to think, more ways to feel, more ways to be than we ever imagined." Jinx's communication device crackled. A new voice, cold and mechanical. "Status report. Are the targets contained?" "Not exactly," Jinx replied, their gaze never leaving Zala's face. "Then eliminate them. The cleansing begins now. The thing about elimination orders is that they tend to clarify everyone's priorities rather quickly." Jinx raised what looked like a standard Academy maintenance tool, but was obviously something far more lethal. Before they could fire, Whisper moved. Not the graceful demonstration she'd given the study group, but the lightning-fast strike of a predator who'd decided negotiations were over. The weapon went flying, clattering into the darkness of the tunnels. Jinx stumbled backward, their eyes wide with the kind of terror that came from realizing you'd fundamentally misunderstood the situation. They're not pets, Zala said conversationally, as Forge positioned himself between Jinx and any potential weapons. They're not guards, and they're definitely not helpless animals who can be eliminated by nervous saboteurs with stolen energy weapons. "The fleet will destroy this place," Jinx stammered. "With or without you. At least this way, some of us might survive." "What fleet?" "The Purification Initiative. 12 species who've decided that humans are too disruptive to galactic stability. Too unpredictable. Too—" they gestured helplessly at the cubs. "Too likely to form inappropriate alliances with dangerous entities." Beckmore, who'd been unusually quiet during the confrontation, stepped forward. The Mordani representative to the Galactic Council voted in favor of expanded human integration just last month. "The official representative," Jinx spat. "The politicians who think they can control the chaos by embracing it. But there are others, those who remember what stability looked like before humans started changing everything." Ghost made a sound that wasn't quite a growl, but carried enough menace to make Jinx step back involuntarily. His phase-shifting abilities were creating a disorienting shimmer effect that made him appear to be in 3 places at once. "Here's what I don't understand," Zala said, moving closer to Jinx with the kind of casual confidence that came from having 3 very capable backup dancers. "You lived with me for months. You saw what they were really like. How could you possibly think they were dangerous?" "Because they changed you!" Jinx's voice cracked with frustration. "You came here as a problem cadet. Reckless, undisciplined, unpredictable. And instead of learning proper protocols, you got worse. More creative. More willing to break rules. More likely to find solutions that nobody had thought of before. And that's bad? It's chaos. It's the breakdown of everything that's kept galactic civilization stable for millennia." The cubs exchanged glances, an actual conversation in a language of subtle movements and shared consciousness. Then, simultaneously, they began to glow. Not the combat readiness they'd shown before, but something else entirely. Something that filled the maintenance tunnel with warm, golden light and made the air itself feel alive with possibility. "What are they doing?" Beckmore whispered. "Showing us something," Zala replied, though she wasn't entirely sure what. The light intensified, and suddenly the tunnel walls became transparent. Through them, Zala could see the Academy's corridors, classrooms, and common areas. But more than that, she could see the connections between people. Streams of light linking cadet to cadet, instructor to student, being in a web of relationships that pulsed with shared understanding. This is what they see, she realized. Not individuals competing for resources, but a community learning and growing together. The vision expanded, showing the approaching fleet, 12 ships moving in perfect formation, their weapons charged and ready. But there was something wrong with the picture. The ships weren't just approaching the Academy, they were surrounded by something else. Larger shapes, moving with the fluid grace that could only mean one thing. "Kethmori battle cruisers," Beckmore breathed. "A full war pride." "They're not here to invade," Zala said, understanding flooding through her. "They're here to collect their young. And they're not going to let anyone else threaten them." The light faded, leaving them in the red glow of emergency lighting. Jinx was staring at the cubs with an expression of dawning horror. "They called their people," they whispered. "The moment they sensed the threat, they sent out a distress signal." "Not a distress signal," Zala corrected. "An invitation. A request for backup from family members who trust their judgment." Ghost's communication device crackled again. The mechanical voice was back, but now it carried an edge of panic. Abort mission. Repeat, abort mission. We have Kethmori warships on intercept courses. This was not part of the intelligence briefing. Because your intelligence was wrong, Zala said, loud enough for the device to pick up her voice. You assumed they were animals. You assumed they were alone. You assumed that humans could be isolated from their chosen allies. Who is this? This is Cadet Zala, speaking for 3 beings who've spent the last 6 months learning what it means to be part of something bigger than themselves. And they've decided that this academy, this community, is worth protecting. Impossible. Animals don't make strategic decisions. Forge stepped forward and, with careful deliberation, placed his paw on Jinx's communication device. The result was immediate and spectacular. Every screen, every display, every piece of electronic equipment in the academy suddenly came alive with information. Not random data, but a comprehensive real-time analysis of the tactical situation, complete with recommended response strategies and detailed intelligence on the attacking fleet. Still think they're just animals? Zala asked. The mechanical voice was silent for a long moment. When it returned, it sounded considerably less confident. This changes the strategic equation. Yeah, it does, because you're not facing a defenseless academy guarded by a few outdated weapon systems. You're facing a Kethmori war pride defending their chosen family. And if there's one thing the galaxy has learned over the past few centuries, it's that you don't mess with Kethmori family. Another pause. Then, withdrawal protocols are now in effect. All units return to jump points immediately. The communication device went silent. Jinx slumped against the tunnel wall, their entire body shaking. They'll be back. This isn't over. Maybe, Zala agreed, but next time, they'll know what they're really dealing with. And maybe they'll think twice about assuming that different means dangerous. She looked down at the 3 cubs, who were now clustered around her in their familiar formation. Not protective, not possessive, but simply present. Choosing to be where they were, with whom they were, because it felt right. The security asked why the cubs were following me, she said to Beckmore, who was still staring at his datapad in amazement. I told you, they don't guard me. They choose me. And you choose them? Every day, she replied. Just like they choose this academy, this community, this strange experiment in different species, learning to work together instead of merely coexisting. Beckmore's mandibles clicked in what she'd learned to recognize as thoughtful consideration. The paperwork for this is going to be unprecedented. Most worthwhile things are, Zala said with a grin. Above them, the emergency klaxons fell silent. The crisis was over. The threat had passed. And somewhere in the Academy's corridors, 60 different species were learning that family came in more forms than anyone had previously imagined. And in Maintenance Tunnel C, 3 cubs settled down for a well-deserved nap, secure in the knowledge that they'd chosen well.